Virgo, the confession is coming. I want to start there with that simple and direct statement. Before the explanation, before the why now, before the description of what the confession contains and what receiving it will feel like for the specific Virgo who thought they would never have it and who is now reading this in the specific and significant moment of learning that what they thought would never come is coming. The confession is coming in the near and real form of something that has been held by the person holding it for long enough that the holding has become harder than the confessing, which is the specific tipping point that always produces the confession when it is finally reached by the person who has been holding what they are about to confess. I also want to speak to the thought you would never have it before anything else, because that particular thought, the one that said you would never have it, is one of the most specific and Virgo forms of the particular way that Virgo minds work. When they are assessing situations that involve other people's interior states and what those interior states are likely to produce, in terms of action and expression toward the Virgo who is doing the assessing, welcome, Virgo, and receive this. The Virgo mind, when assessing what other people are likely to do or say, uses the available evidence in the specific and careful form of someone who does not want to be wrong about what they expect in the particular and costly direction of expecting something that does not arrive, which is more uncomfortable for Virgo than not having expected it at all, and therefore not having the disappointment of something not arriving that was anticipated in the specific and hopeful form of an expectation. So Virgo manages expectations in the direction of the evidence rather than in the direction of the hope. When evidence and hope are pointing in different directions, which they often are, in situations where the hope is for something that the available evidence is not yet confirming, in the specific and direct form that the Virgo assessment needs before it will move the expectation in the direction of the hope rather than in the direction of the evidence that is not yet supporting what the hope is pointing toward. I want to speak about the particular cost of this specific Virgo habit of assessment, because it is a habit that serves Virgo well in many situations, and that is genuinely useful as a way of navigating the uncertainty of other people's interior states and what those states are likely to produce in terms of action and expression toward the Virgo who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the situation they are assessing. But it has a specific and important limitation that this situation is making visible in the particular form of the thought that the confession would never come, which was based on the visible evidence, and which was wrong because the visible evidence was not the complete picture of what was actually happening in the interior of the person, whose interior was not visible to the Virgo assessment. The limitation is this: other people's interior states are not visible evidence. They are invisible evidence. And the Virgo assessment, which is built on visible evidence, will always have a gap between its estimate of what is happening internally in someone else and what is actually happening internally in that someone else, because the internal is not available as visible evidence to the assessment that requires visible evidence. For its conclusions, the gap is where the confession lives, in the invisible interior that the Virgo assessment was unable to access with its visible evidence-based methodology. And that is now crossing from invisible to visible in the form of the arriving confession that the assessment concluded would never come from the invisible interior, where it was always present, building toward the tipping point. That has now arrived, was the Virgo assessment of the evidence in the specific and careful form of someone who had looked at the evidence and found it insufficient to support the expectation of the confession arriving in the form it was hoped for at the time the assessment was made, with the evidence available at that time, which was pointing in a different direction than the direction the confession was actually building toward in the interior of the person holding it, without the Virgo having access to that interior dimension of the evidence, because the interior was not visible from the outside where the Virgo was doing the assessing. The Virgo was right about the visible evidence and wrong about the full picture, because the full picture included the invisible evidence of the interior of the person who has been holding the confession and building toward the confessing in the interior and invisible form that the Virgo assessment did not have access to when it reached the conclusion that the confession would never come. The confession is coming from the invisible interior of the person who has been holding it there, and whose holding has reached the tipping point where the confessing is now easier than the holding, and the invisible interior is about to become the visible and expressed exterior of someone who is confessing what they have been holding to the specific Virgo who thought they would never have it, because the invisible interior was not available to the Virgo assessment that produced the thought of never. Now I want to describe the confession itself in the specific and honest terms that will allow you to recognize it when it arrives, rather than miss it or receive it only partially, in the form it actually takes, which may be different from the form the Virgo was expecting when the thought of the confession was still in the future possible form, rather than the arriving form. It is now taking, the confession is about feeling specifically, not about facts or about what happened or about what was done or not done. In the actionable and external dimension of what confessions sometimes are when they are about things. That happened in the visible and external world, that the person confessing did or failed to do, and that the confession is acknowledging in the honest and direct form of someone who is saying what they did or failed to do out loud for the first time. The confession is about feeling in the interior and personal form of someone who is saying what they feel about you specifically out loud for the first time after having held the feeling in the interior and private form for the full period of the holding that the Virgo was doing the assessment during and finding insufficient evidence in for the expected arrival of the confession that is now arriving in the near and specific form of something that can no longer be held. I want to describe what has been happening in the person holding the confession over the period of the holding, because I think the description of the interior experience of holding something this significant for this long will change how you receive the confession when it arrives from the place of fuller understanding of what it cost the person confessing to hold it as long as they held it. Before the tipping point arrived and the confessing became the only available movement, holding something significant in your interior for a long time produces a specific and compounding form of weight that accumulates with the holding rather than diminishing as held things sometimes diminish when the holding is of something that loses its intensity over time and becomes less pressing the longer it is held without expression. This did not lose its intensity. Over the period of the holding, it gained intensity in the specific and compounding way of something that grows in the holding rather than diminishing, because the holding was the holding of something real and real things, when they are held without expression, tend to grow rather than diminish, because the not expressing gives them the interior space to develop without the release. That expression would have provided if it had happened earlier rather than at the tipping point that has now arrived. What they are confessing to you has been growing in them for the entire period of the holding. And what arrives in the confession is the full and grown form of what was present at the beginning of the holding, in the smaller and less developed form that it was in before the holding gave it the interior space to grow into the full form that the tipping point is now releasing into the confessed and expressed form that the Virgo is about to receive is more than the Virgo assessment estimated in the specific and significant form of something that has been building rather than remaining static at the level it was at. When the Virgo assessment last updated, its estimate of what was being felt on the other side of the visible evidence that was available to the assessment, the feeling has been growing in the specific and invisible interior of the person holding it. since the last Virgo assessment of what was likely on the other side of the visible, and the growing has produced the specific and tipping point form of something that has become too large to remain in the interior without the costs of the containing, exceeding the costs of the expressing in the specific and always arriving form of the tipping point. That produces the confession that the Virgo is about to receive. I want to say something about why this confession is arriving now, specifically for this specific Virgo, rather than at some earlier or later point in the period during which the holding was happening and the tipping point was building toward the arrival that is now near. The confession is arriving now because of something you did, or something you became, or something that happened in your life. In the recent and specific period, that shifted something in the person holding the confession about their estimate of the risk of confessing versus the cost of continuing to hold. The specific thing that shifted their estimate is something about you that they observed or learned or understood in a new way in the recent period that produced in them a different calculation of what confessing would produce in the specific form of your response to the confession when you receive it. What they understood about you newly is something specific to the Virgo and to what the Virgo has been showing in the recent period without necessarily knowing that it was being seen and understood in the new and shifting way. That produced the different calculation. That is now producing the confession. They understood that you are safe to confess to in the specific and rare form of someone who receives confessions in the accurate and non-reactive way of someone who hears what is being said and holds it carefully and responds from the considered place rather than the reactive one that makes confessing to some people more costly than the holding because of what the reactive response does to what was confessed. And to the person who confessed it, you are safe to confess to. And they have understood this in the recent and specific period. That has shifted the calculation from holding is safer to confessing is safer in the now arriving form of the confession that this reading is telling you is coming. Now, what to do with the knowing that the confession is coming before it has arrived in whatever specific form your life delivers it. The first, do not prepare a response in advance. In the specific Virgo form of someone who, having been told that something significant is arriving, begins to prepare the considered and measured response that the significant thing will deserve when it arrives, and who brings the prepared response to the arriving of the significant thing, rather than the spontaneous and genuine response that the arriving produces in the moment without the preparation. The person confessing needs the spontaneous and genuine response rather than the prepared one, because the spontaneous and genuine confirms the safety that they understood about you in the new and shifting way. That produced the calculation shift. That made the confessing possible. For someone who has been holding for as long as they have been holding the prepared response, even when it is more considered and measured than the spontaneous one, does not confirm the safety in the same way, because the preparation is visible in the way that prepared things are always visible, as prepared to the person who is watching closely enough to see the difference between prepared and genuine, which is what someone who has just confessed something is doing with intense and specific attention in the immediate aftermath of the confessing, when what the other person does and says is the most important available information about whether the confessing was the right thing to do. Be genuine, Virgo, in the spontaneous and real form of someone who is responding to what has just been confessed to them from the unmanaged place of what they actually feel when the confession lands in the full and real form of something that has been held for the full period of the holding, and that is now being offered in the vulnerable and complete form of a genuine confession to the specific Virgo who is safe to receive it. And the second, receive the confession as the answer to the thought that it would never come, not only as the information it contains, though the information is significant and will change things between you and the person confessing in the specific ways that confessions change things when they have been held for the full period of the holding and are finally expressed in the complete and honest form that the tipping point produced, but also as the evidence that the Virgo assessment of never was based on incomplete information rather than on accurate information about the full picture that the interior of the person confessing was holding in the invisible form that the assessment did not have access to, and that the confession is now providing access to in the full and expressed form of what was always there behind the visible evidence that the Virgo assessment had access to, and that produced the thought of never that this confession is now answering. The confession is the answer to the thought that it would never come. Virgo, the thing you thought you would never have is coming to you in the full and confessed form of someone who has held it for long enough that the holding has exceeded the cost of the confessing, and who has found you to be safe enough to confess to in the specific and understood form that the Virgo is safe for this particular confession from this particular person at this particular moment of their interior's tipping point into the expression of what was always there, waiting to be confessed when the conditions were right, which they now are, receive it. Virgo, in the genuine and open form of the specific person who was understood to be safe enough for this specific confession and who now has the opportunity to confirm that understanding by being exactly that. In the moment the confession arrives, and after you have received it in the genuine and open form, that confirms the safety, that produced the willingness to confess. Let yourself acknowledge to yourself in the private and interior form of someone who deserves to acknowledge it, that the Virgo assessment of never was wrong, not in the self-critical form of someone cataloging an error, but in the specific and grateful form of someone who is glad that the assessment was wrong. Because being wrong in this specific way is what produces the confession that the Virgo thought would never come, and that is now arriving as the evidence that there was always more in the invisible interior of the person confessing. Then the visible evidence allowed the assessment to see, be glad to be wrong, Virgo, in this specific and arriving form of the thing you thought would never come. That is coming right now in the near and real and confessed form of what was always there, waiting for the tipping point. That has now arrived.